Hello, my name is Penny Jane Burke and I'm a sociologist of gender, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce you today to some sociological ways of thinking about sex, gender, and sexuality. And we're going to be thinking about this in 4 parts. So the first part will be to explore sociological perspectives of gender. In part 2, I'm going to introduce you to gender theory. In part 3, we're going to explore gender in relation to social change, masculinities, and patriarchy. And in the final part, we're going to look at some feminist theories and sexuality and gender. So in part 1, we're going to explore sociological perspectives of gender. So to start with, as a foundation to think about how sex and gender are defined through the lens of gender theory, sociological theories of gender. Sex refers to the biological and physiological referenced categories such as male, female, intersex, for example. And that's different from gender, which refers to the social, cultural, and psychological qualities that are constructed and then projected upon human bodies. So if we think about femininity, for example, how is that constructed? And then how is that projected upon particular bodies? And similarly with masculinity, how is masculinity constructed? And how does that then shape particular bodies? What's the relationship to the way we think about masculinity and we think about the bodies that we project masculinity onto? So why study gender in the first place? Well, gender is so much a part of our everyday experiences, the way we construct our identity and our sense of self, how we experience the social world. So it's really important to understand how gendered identities structure our interactions within our everyday lives, within our families, our communities, our society, with ourselves and with each other. So it really helps to bring to light some of those taken for granted things that we live on an everyday basis. And it helps us to understand better how gender shapes our relationality, so how we view others and ourselves in the world. It helps us to develop an understanding of how gendered structures form the basis of power and the way resources are allocated within and across society differently and often unequally due to those gender structures. So when we talk about structures in sociology, we think about, for example, how within institutions like the family, historically, the family has been constructed around gender differences, and that has differently allocated resources historically and perhaps continues to do so, and also how power circulates within the family, as an example. And so sociologists want to understand how these structures create different kinds of roles around gender, the different rules that regulate our behaviors and our practices, and the expectations that different constructions of gender force upon different kinds of bodies and people, and how that constrains or enables our sense of identity, our aspirations, and our sort of location in the social world. We might call these normative constructions because they're so naturalized that we take them for granted. We almost think that they are innate, but actually they are formed through our everyday social interactions and through these different kinds of roles that pre-exist our existence to an extent, although we're actively taking these up, and the different roles and expectations around these normative constructions. So if we think about that in relationship to masculinity, we might very quickly be able to think about some of the normative constructions around what it might mean to be a man in this world or to be a boy, and the rules that are around that in terms of, for example, the way that we're expected to dress or behave, and those normative constructions that constrain our everyday practices. So sociology is really important because it helps to, by bringing these things to light, challenge everyday taken for granted views of what it might mean to be female or male in society, for example. And it emphasizes that gender is socially constructed, and it's not just socially constructed at the individual level, but it's about the wider social structures and the cultural context in which we as individuals experience our gender identities. Sociology recognizes that gender does not intrinsically belong to a particular kind of body. So in making a distinction between sex and gender, it's about bringing to light the ways in which different bodies are gendered, and that gender is formed and reformed over time through our different kinds of practices that we take up in relation to those wider rules that I talked about, or the wider expectations. We might break those rules, or we might conform to those, but again, this is not about the individual, it's about how we're located in those wider structures and power relations. And sociology identifies patriarchy as a central structure in the experience of being a gendered person. And of course, it's important to break the binary constructions that form particular views of gender around being male or female, for example. So thinking about sociological theories of gender helps to think about the ways that this is contested within sociology. So there's no one way to understand gender, and this is just 3 different perspectives that I'm sharing with you now, which you will be familiar with from your other lectures. So we've already looked at functionalism and conflict theory and symbolic interaction, but if we think about those in relationship to gender, it helps to deepen our understanding of how these different theoretical perspectives shape different views of being a person in society. So a functionalist view of gender inequality would see it as an orderly mechanism for the division of labor. So for example, the idea traditionally and within functionalism that there's a division of labor about the kinds of work that women might undertake compared to men in the family. And that is from a functionalist view, that's a way that society can function. So key concepts and processes are the expressive tasks that might be involved in that. So for example, that might be undertaking domestic labor, unpaid labor quite a lot of the time in the domestic sphere, as opposed to undertaking labor that's associated with being a leader or being an engineer or a mathematician, which historically has a kind of gendered division of labor within functionalism. And conflict theory sees gender inequality as a form of social stratification. So there's a tension, there's a conflict there in which there's a domination of one group over another group. So the idea that power is unequal and that power is unequally shaped by the relationship between men and women in society. And there's a subordination that comes through that domination of men over women through various different institutions like the family or like work, for example, or religion might be another example. And that there's a sense of false consciousness that those unequal power relations are conformed to because this is seen as supposedly natural or a natural order of things rather than about unequal power relations. Symbolic interaction, on the other hand, might see gender inequality as transmitted from generation to generation through what we call gender role socialization. So we learn how to be a girl or a boy, for example, through our socialization within different social institutions, like education, like the family, like work, for example. And this is related to concepts like gender stereotypes, and also the way we self-define what it means to be gendered, what it means to be, for example, a girl in society. So functionalism views of gender inequality draw attention to the roles that we play in this broader machine of society, that in order for it to function, we must play those roles. And Talcott Parsons, who you've already studied earlier in the course, developed the idea of the nuclear family, this idea that there is a natural role, a kind of, a necessary role of the father and the mother, and there's a division of labor in the family to look after the children. And in this understanding of the family, men are constructed as better suited for the role of providing material support, earning money, being the authority figure, and so on, whereas women are constructed around the idea of providing emotional support, the nurturing role, and a particular aesthetic around femininity that comes from that. Conflict theories believe that historically men have had access to most of society's resources and privilege, and that continues on in unequal power relations in society today, and that it is in the interest of men as a group to maintain that position and to resist trends towards gender equality. So although there may be ideas of equality of opportunity, that men as a group might want to maintain their interests by ensuring that through particular means they maintain control within influential sites, social sites, like government, for example, or like the law, or like big corporations, and so on. And symbolic interactionism is about highlighting the processes by which gender is socially constructed, but also maintained and reproduced through everyday practices, through things that we kind of take for granted. So, for example, in the media, in representations of what it is to look like a woman or to look like a man, for example. And that we learn this through sex role socialization, through these everyday interactions with these images and these representations, these constructions in our social worlds, which might include social institutions like schools, for example, or workplaces. And so our socialization doesn't stop necessarily at childhood. It goes on as we interact in various different ways in these social environments.